Canada's trade war with the U.S. now. The port of Churchill could soon be a very strategic asset.
President Trump's trade war is affecting America's ports. Container shipment bookings are down nearly 50% from a year ago.
Major drops in cargo at U.S. ports due to tariffs.
Donald Trump once put forward a demand to take control of Canada's most strategic seaports, but Prime Minister Mark Carney flatly rejected the idea, slamming the door shut in his face. This move amounted to a direct blow to America's already strained and fragile supply chain. The trade leverage Washington once held is steadily slipping away, while Canada's port system continues to expand, stretching beyond U.S. oversight. For years, Trump assured voters that building tariff walls and enforcing tough regulations would protect domestic jobs and restore the U.S. economy to its former glory. From steel and aluminium to lumber and energy, he consistently framed each clash with trading partners as a battle for sovereignty. Yet those very battles ignited a global wave of retaliation, with Canada emerging as one of the fiercest responders. Washington once tried to tighten its grip on Ottawa through a barrage of heavy tariffs, only to be met with unexpectedly strong resistance. While American industries now struggle with mounting unpredictable costs, Canada has chosen a different path. Carney's government is pouring major investment into new port projects, brushing aside Trump's attempts to wedge his way into Canadian trade. This week, tensions hit their peak. According to sources, Trump quietly pressed Ottawa, demanding deeper involvement in Canadian port operations on the grounds that U.S. economic security was at risk. Instead of backing down, Prime Minister Carney countered with ambitious expansion plans. Montreal's Contour Terminal is set for a major upgrade, while Churchill Port in Manitoba, long neglected, is being revived. These steps will allow Canada's minerals, energy, and industrial goods to move directly to Europe and Asia, without detouring through the United States. News of the port projects followed Carney's whirlwind trip to Europe, where he signed new trade agreements with Germany and Latvia, paving the way for liquefied natural gas, copper, and other strategic mineral exports. The driving force behind these plans is Bill C-5, an infrastructure bill both contentious and transformative, scheduled to take effect within weeks. For Washington, the timing could not be worse. The U.S. port system is already congested, costly, and buckling under skyrocketing shipping expenses. Trump had once hoped to ease domestic pressure by extending U.S. influence over Canadian ports, seeing it as a way to shoulder part of America's supply chain burden. But instead of letting Washington take the wheel, Ottawa has chosen self-reliance, pouring billions into modern terminals and making it unmistakably clear that Canada's trade future will be determined by Canada. Ports once considered extensions of the U.S. logistics system are now shaping up as direct competitors on the global stage. The impact of this decision is already being felt deep inside the United States. Mineral mines in Arizona, Nevada, and West Virginia are facing difficulties as international buyers shift their orders through Canada. Copper shipping contracts that once sustained thousands of American jobs are now redirected north, leaving a major gap in U.S. export volumes. For coal, a pillar in Trump's pledge to revive energy, the situation is even worse. Canadian ports are being ready to export liquefied natural gas, along with a slate of cleaner, higher-value minerals, pushing American coal further to the margins. Coal industry associations are warning of mass layoffs in towns entirely dependent on mining. In Montana, transport companies that used to haul rare earths for mining firms now face the risk of contracts being cancelled. In Kentucky, where many plants are tied to coal shipments, owners have raised the prospect of cutting hours or temporarily shutting down, and the consequences extend far beyond mining communities. The electronic sector, which only recently began to recover from the chip shortage, is once again under pressure as mineral supplies stop flowing through U.S. ports, driving costs higher. Every smartphone, every electric vehicle depends on cobalt, lithium, and rare earths. Yet, as Canada refuses to let Washington dictate terms, these resources are now being shipped directly to Europe and Asia, leaving American firms scrambling for alternatives. Even the domestic energy sector is facing mounting strain. Churchill Port, once known only for grain exports, is now being upgraded to receive and handle LNG shipments. European customers seeking to break free from Russian gas dependency have already signed contracts with Canadian suppliers. Each new agreement across the Atlantic represents another market slipping beyond Washington's control. Meanwhile, American workers are watching opportunities vanish before their eyes. Steel workers, once hailed by Trump as symbols of tariff success, are now struggling with declining orders. Rising material costs are stalling projects, and contractors warned that housing construction expenses could climb by tens of thousands of dollars if trade tensions continue to choke supplies of steel and lumber. Farmers in the U.S. are faring no better. Already hurt by retaliatory measures targeting grain and meat, they now face extra costs for fertilizer and machinery just to keep production going. The strain is equally visible across international shipping routes. At Germany's Bremerhaven port, cargo that once moved through U.S. hubs now sits idle as buyers turn to more reliable transshipment points. In Antwerp, Chinese electric vehicles that were once bound for the American market are being redirected to Europe at competitive prices, piling pressure on U.S. automakers. And in Halifax, Canadian officials openly acknowledge a new reality. As American goods are increasingly ring-fenced for domestic use, Canada has no choice but to expand its own production capacity to guarantee supply for other partners. For the United States, this means it has lost the quiet advantage it long enjoyed in leveraging Canada's port infrastructure. Many experts argue the main cause lies in Trump's heavy-handed tariff policy. By slapping a 25% tariff on Canadian steel, aluminium, and automobiles, along with additional duties on energy and minerals, he inadvertently pushed Ottawa down the path of self-reliance instead of dependence. Mark Carney's port development strategy is not merely an infrastructure plan. It is a direct response to pressure from Washington. For the first time in decades, Canada has declared that its ports will function as independent hubs rather than auxiliary links in America's trade network. U.S. industries, especially the auto sector, are already feeling the effects and sounding alarms. In Michigan, officials fear that restrictions on steel and aluminum exports could bring assembly lines to a halt. In Texas, electronics plants are seeing profits shrink as the cost of imported components climbs. Even GF Coast ports, once America's dominant gateways, now face competition from Canadian LG shipments that can reach Europe in half the time. The political price is equally stark. Trump had promised that tough tariff walls would force allies to concede and keep the US in the top spot. Yet, Canada's refusal has shown that Washington's influence is no longer absolute. Rather than yielding, Carney is securing contracts from Europe, drawing international investment, and involving Indigenous communities in projects designed to free Canada from American dominance. For a president whose image rests on leverage and pressure, the outcome is nothing short of a blow to pride. What was once promoted as protection for American workers has now become a source of instability. Even U.S. labor unions are voicing anger as political decisions heap the burden onto the very communities Trump pledged to protect. On the West Coast, dock workers anxiously watch Canada advance major port expansion projects in Vancouver and Montreal. Many fear that cargo flows will increasingly shift northward, draining revenue and jobs from Seattle, Los Angeles, and even New York. The International Longshoremen's Association has issued a warning. Thousands of U.S. jobs could vanish if carriers choose to move goods through Canada to escape tariff crossfire. And it is not only dock workers who are worried. Truck drivers are also caught in tighter new regulations, threatening to push many immigrant workers out, just as cross-border trade needs more manpower than ever. For many in America's heartland, this is a bitter paradox. Trump once touted his trade wars as a shield for coal miners, steel workers, and farmers. Yet in the end, they are the ones facing layoffs, canceled contracts, and rising costs. Businesses, too, are showing their frustration. A shipping executive in the Midwest put it bluntly: "You can't build a stable supply chain when the rules change every single day." At the consumer level, the consequences are spreading. Prices for electronics, automobiles, and even basic household appliances are climbing sharply. With back-to-school season approaching, retailers are warning of empty shelves. While parents are left disappointed, analysts predict that if Canada continues to pursue its independent port strategy, the cost of everything from smartphones to farm tractors will keep climbing even higher. For the White House, the outlook is far from bright. Trump's demand to gain influence over Canadian ports, initially seen as a show of strength, has instead exposed weakness. Mark Carney's outright rejection paired with billions of dollars in investment at Newport has placed Canada in a new position, emerging as the primary gateway for North America's mineral and energy trade. For the first time, the U.S. faces a challenge in its own backyard, not from China or Russia, but from its closest neighbor. The consequences are evident. American jobs shaken, domestic industries unsettled, and consumers burdened with higher costs. Meanwhile, Washington's influence wanes, while Ottawa grows increasingly confident. The president who once vowed to make America great again now confronts the opposite picture. A trade war turning against him. A Canada unwilling to yield, and an economy that allies perceive as weakening. This is no longer an ordinary trade dispute. It has become a turning point in the global economic order. Canada's port strategy is a clear declaration. Its future lies in direct connections with Europe and Asia, not as an assistant to the US. And the ripple effects are already crossing the Atlantic. With Russia isolated, and the war in Ukraine disrupting energy flows, Europe is desperate for new supply. Canada's expansion of the Contour port in Montreal and the transformation of Churchill into a modern energy hub have been warmly welcomed in Berlin and Brussels. German officials, once skeptical of Canadian LNG, now see Carney as a reliable partner. Every cargo ship leaving Canadian ports for Hamburg or Rotterdam reduces Europe's reliance on US ports or Gulf pipelines across the Pacific. Japan, South Korea, and even China are closely tracking Canada's new course. For years, many nations were almost entirely dependent on US port infrastructure, which meant being drawn into Washington's cycle of tariffs, politics, and shifting regulations. Now, as Canada expands its capacity with support from local governments and Indigenous investment, they see a way out. Vancouver and Prince Rupert ports are preparing to handle volumes that once had no choice but to flow through Los Angeles, Seattle, or Houston. This shift shakes one of Washington's deepest assumptions that every North American supply chain must ultimately run through the US. Trump sought to reinforce this belief by forcing control over Canadian ports, securing the image of America as the gatekeeper of trade. But Carney's firm refusal, combined with massive new infrastructure spending, has dismantled that argument. Canada no longer stands behind the US. It is building its own path, attracting capital from across the world. International finance has begun to shift perspective. Where Canadian ports were once seen as secondary options, they are now considered essential links in the global trade network. The future price of lumber, copper, or LNG may depend more on Canada's capacity than on America's. Some analysts even predict that if projects stay on schedule, benchmark prices could be set in Montreal and Vancouver rather than Chicago or New York. This is not merely an economic change. It is a psychological one. It signals clearly that US dominance in setting prices and controlling supply chains is eroding. For Washington's allies, the message carries weight. Europe, Japan, and Australia are weary of America's unpredictable tariff policies. They watch Trump impose duties without distinguishing between friend and foe, only to reverse course days later. That made many governments hesitate before signing long-term deals with the US. In contrast, Canada is building the image of a trustworthy partner, acting by rules, not political whims. Carney has just signed a joint declaration with Germany on critical minerals, and rumors suggest a string of further agreements is on the way. These commitments are not only commercial, they are a statement of trust, the belief that Canada will not wield tariffs as a political weapon, and that trust may help drive a deeper shift in global power. For decades, America's strength rested not only on its military, but also on its grip over global trade arteries. The US dollar reigned as the world's reserve currency. Gulf ports stood at the center of energy, and major US harbors served as gateways for goods worldwide. Yet now, one of its closest allies has chosen a different path. With a $500 billion infrastructure package aimed squarely at linking Europe and Asia, Canada is sending a clear signal. It will no longer allow Washington to dictate its future. This shift has not escaped America's rivals. In Beijing, strategists have spent years trying to undermine Washington's dominance in global commerce. The Belt and Road Initiative was proof of that ambition, with railways, ports, and energy pipelines stretching across continents. Yet, Canada's turn, quieter and less theatrical, may prove equally consequential. By deliberately bridging both the Atlantic and Pacific routes, Ottawa automatically narrows America's reach. Chinese scholars have noted that if Canadian ports become North America's key transit hubs, Beijing will be able to work directly with Ottawa on strategic minerals, bypassing Washington. That shift alone alters the balance of power, weakening U.S. bargaining leverage, not only with China, but across Asia as a whole. For Washington, the shock is not only economic, but reputational. Trump may have wanted to project strength by demanding control. But what the world saw instead was a clear rejection, and not just a private refusal, but one made public in Berlin, with the German Chancellor standing alongside Mark Carney. In diplomatic language, this is no longer a minor disagreement. It is a warning. America's closest ally has declared to the world that it will not be placed under control. What makes it even harder for Washington to swallow is the timing of Carney's statement. He signed mineral agreements in Europe, both signaling defiance and giving new momentum to Canada. The impact has rippled into NATO, as many European leaders already weary of America's erratic trade policies are beginning to view Canada as a more stable partner to rely on. The energy ministers of Latvia and Poland have recently hinted that future LNG supplies from Canada could serve as a shield against their dependence on Russia. If this prospect becomes reality, Washington will lose one of its most important diplomatic tools, the promise of energy as leverage to contain Moscow. In that scenario, it would be Canada, not the United States, guaranteeing Europe's energy security. This also marks a turning point in North American political relations. For decades, the U.S. saw Canada as a subordinate partner, assuming that Canadian goods would flow south before reaching the world. Trump's demand to control Canadian ports was simply an extension of that mindset. When U.S. ports were congested, Canada could serve as a backup, but always under Washington's rules. Carney's outright refusal sent a powerful message not only to America, but also to Canadians themselves. Canada will no longer be the extended arm of the U.S. economy. That declaration resonated like a statement of independence, especially among voters who still recall that era of punitive tariffs on steel, aluminium, and lumber. That is why Carney's speeches on ports often weave in key words like sovereignty, self-reliance, and resilience. And the map of North American trade is being redrawn before our eyes. Rail lines that once carried Canadian goods into the American Midwest are being redirected straight to Europe. Wheat and grain that once flowed south are now loaded onto ships bound across the Atlantic. Churchill Port, once dismissed as a remote outpost, has suddenly become central to Canada's Arctic strategy, and a destination Europe counts on for stable supply. Every ship that departs without passing through U.S. customs, every trade deal signed without Washington's involvement, chips away at America's supposedly indispensable role. Global corporations are adjusting quickly to this new reality. Many major shipping companies have already shifted operations, and most say Ottawa's consistent regulatory system is more reliable than Washington's unpredictable tariff policies. Not a few multinationals that once routed contracts through Houston or Los Angeles are now signing with Montreal and Vancouver. This carries enormous financial risks for the U.S. as billions of dollars in container traffic, minerals, and energy are diverted north. For Canada, it is a story of expanding influence and growing strength. For America, it is one of eroding leverage and diminishing advantage. And ultimately, these economic shifts carry strategic security implications. American strategists have always understood that economic power is the foundation of military strength. The vast port network and global logistics system enabled Washington to project force overseas with ease. But if Canada builds an independent port infrastructure linking directly to Europe and Asia, the U.S. will face a difficult choice. Either accept a diminished role, or try to tighten control at the cost of straining relations with its closest ally. Whatever path it takes, America's image as the leader will fade. Russia and China will surely see this as an opportunity to exploit. On the diplomatic front, the impact is already visible. When Mark Carney announced Canada's decision in Berlin, it was no longer just domestic policy. For allies, it was proof they no longer needed Washington's approval to sign trade agreements. German media even described it as the beginning of a post-American era for transatlantic commerce. In Brussels, many officials admitted that working with Ottawa carries fewer risks than with Washington, since Canadian politics are more stable and predictable. This is a profound shift in perception, especially after decades of the US being regarded as the backbone of the Western Bloc. Now, even within that alliance, the foundations are shaking. The lesson extends beyond Europe to Africa and Southeast Asia. Countries that once depended heavily on imported copper, fertilizer, or aluminium now see Canada as a third option alongside the US and China. They no longer feel forced to choose between Washington and Beijing, but can sign directly with Ottawa. This steadily weakens America's bargaining power at global forums. From the World Trade Organization to climate and energy summits, America's ability to impose conditions is diminishing. And in geopolitics, perception is worth as much as strength. Trump viewed his demand for control over Canadian ports as a test of power. But Carney's blunt refusal in Europe in front of world leaders became a symbol of Washington's weakness. Whether or not the US could coerce Canada is irrelevant. What the world remembers is America making demands and Canada saying no. That image resonates across capitals, encouraging other nations to resist US pressure in the future. Looking ahead, Canada's scale of ambition is undeniable. This is no longer about a handful of pilot projects, but a nation-building program worth $500 billion with effects lasting decades. Once the Control port in Montreal comes online, it will handle millions of containers annually. An upgraded Churchill will open a new Arctic corridor to Europe. Together, they form a parallel trade system entirely independent of Washington. And once that infrastructure is complete, no US administration, no matter how well-intentioned, will be able to restore the lost leverage. For American businesses and workers, the consequences are clear. Tariffs once advertised as tools to force allies into line are now pushing them away. Canada is no longer standing alone. Mexico is also quietly strengthening its trade ties with Europe and Asia. The result is that the North American continent now revolves around Washington less than at any point in modern history. The slogan "America First" is being replaced by a new reality. America is increasingly left on the sidelines. The danger for Washington has never been greater. What began as a dispute over tariffs has turned into a turning point in global power. If it fails to adapt, the US could lose not only its economic advantage, but also the credibility that has long underpinned its role as global leader. What Trump intended as leverage to force Canada into submission is backfiring, accelerating Ottawa's drive toward independence. Within a few years, the expansion of Montreal, Churchill, and Vancouver ports could reshape the entire North American trade structure. And economists warned that ordinary Americans will feel the impact first. The cost of living is at risk of soaring. Car prices, electronics, and even basic energy could climb if Canadian ports become the main gateways for trade with Europe and Asia. By rerouting strategic minerals, LNG, and manufactured goods directly across the Atlantic and Pacific, Ottawa is ensuring that foreign customers are prioritized while American consumers pay higher prices. For many households already strained by inflation, this prospect is not just an inconvenience, but a real burden. This is a political powder cake. American industries face even greater danger. Companies in Detroit, Chicago, and other industrial hubs, long reliant on steady cross-border flows, now fear Canada will prioritize contracts with Europe instead of the US. Business leaders are being forced to reassess supply chains, suspend multi-billion-dollar investments, and renegotiate contracts once considered secure. The fallout is significant. Railways and pipelines that the US relied on for Canadian imports are being redirected to serve global markets. Meanwhile, Washington seems to be running out of moves. Retaliatory tariffs only make matters worse, hitting American farmers and manufacturers who depend on the Canadian market to survive. Diplomatic outreach has failed as well. Carney stood firm in Berlin, and there is little reason to expect him to shift course now. That leaves the White House facing a cold political reality. Either accept Canada's independent path, or risk fracturing the alliance by trying to coerce its neighbor. Both options undermine the image of dominance Trump promised. On the international stage, the consequences are even heavier. Europe is placing its trust in Canadian port infrastructure as insurance against Moscow's instability. In Asia, governments are beginning to see Canada as a credible long-term partner. If these relationships take root, the US will face a reality where its allies no longer need Washington to access strategic goods. That would mean a loss of leverage at the negotiating table, weaker ability to impose sanctions, and a fading voice in international disputes. For the first time in generations, the US risks being seen not as the pillar of global trade, but as just another competitor in the arena. At home, the political cost is mounting. Trump built his image on the promise of restoring America's greatness through tough trade policies. But the current image, an America making demands, and a Canada openly refusing, has shattered that narrative. Workers face layoffs, costs are climbing, and supply chains are thinning. These are realities no campaign slogan can hide. In America's swing states, where jobs are tied to mining and manufacturing, discontent is rising and could reshape politics in unpredictable ways. Meanwhile, Canada is moving forward with confidence. Bill C-5 has given Ottawa a strong legal framework to push massive infrastructure projects. The federal government is working hand in hand with provinces. Indigenous representatives have a seat at the negotiating table, and international investors are lining up to pour capital into new ports and railways. What began as a reaction to tariffs has now evolved into a national strategy, one designed to defend sovereignty and cement Canada's independence for decades to come. The coming decade will reveal the full picture. But one thing is clear: the era of America holding absolute control over North American trade routes is drawing to a close. What Trump envisioned as a show of strength may instead be remembered as the catalyst that pushed Canada onto a path of self-reliance and offered the world an alternative to Washington. For the US, this is not a passing shock, but the beginning of a long, uncertain adjustment in its role within the global economy. From shipping costs to factory jobs, from household spending to international alliances, the chain reaction is only just beginning. Meanwhile, Canada is busy signing deals. Europe and Asia are finalizing contracts, and Washington is scrambling to catch up. The day's message could not be clearer. Trump sought to control Canada's ports. Carney said no. And that refusal has forced America into a corner at the very moment when its workers and industries are most vulnerable. This story is far from over. The confrontation has only just begun, and the next steps taken by both sides will decide whether the US can regain its advantage or watch it slip away uncontrollably.